the claw. The claw is our master. The claw chooses who will go and who will stay. And if the claw picks you, you just feel so grateful, so much gratitude that you kind of forget to ask how much we actually been paid for this job. Hello, comrades. So I am making this video all about being a theatre worker or a theatre enthusiast. What does that mean? Good question. So this is a really important thing because our perspectives as a theatre worker are very different to those of being a theatre enthusiast or an artist. So as an artist, you might want to learn your lines for day one of rehearsals so that you can then hit the ground running and start doing some awesome stuff in the rehearsal room. But as a worker, you might be like, I'm not being paid for any of that time. And usually people learn their lines in rehearsals. So unless I'm going to get paid a line learning fee before rehearsals, why would I do this? This is just going to be kind of stealing potential work time from me, or when I could be doing another job or whatever. So these two perspectives are kind of in conflict with each other. But this video we're going to watch now, bunch of us made it for The World Transformed YouTube, and I've shown it to loads of people. I think it's quite a useful tool for organizing arts workers to just get them thinking in this particular way. So it's written by this guy, Mediocre Dave. He's Mediocre Dave on the platform formerly known as Twitter. And I just think his stuff is brilliant. He always explores really important ideas really, really well and really concisely. And I just think he's great. So yeah, he wrote the text for this, and then a bunch of us from A Good Night Out Socialist Theatre Workers reading group did the voiceovers for it. And this lovely artist, Siddhi Gupta, she did the illustrations. So yeah, check it out. I'll jabber along every so often. Check it out.
What perspective do you adopt when you criticize theatre or imagine how it can be improved? When we think of how to reform theatre, we often conflate two separate questions. How can theatre look more like we want it to, and how can we improve our working lives within it? Sometimes these perspectives coincide with and complement one another. More diverse casting, for example, would allow theatre to live up to its potential as a vehicle for progressive social values and positive cultural representation, a benefit to society as a whole, and also provide better prospects and conditions of employment for people who have been historically marginalised, a benefit to theatre workers. On the other hand, these two perspectives frequently come into conflict. As a playgoer, my ideal theatre industry would be one in which nothing came before the quality of the work. As a theatre worker, my ideal industry would be one of adequate pay, safe conditions, and reasonable hours.
Yeah, so I mean, he words that so well. There's these two perspectives that you've got. You've got a theatre enthusiast who goes to the theatre in order to see something amazing that can, feel transformative, and, you have a wonderful time, or you're just entertained or whatever. So like he says in that, nothing should come before the quality of the work from the perspective of the theatre enthusiast. However, as a worker, and you might be both a theatre enthusiast and a theatre worker, most theatre workers are theatre enthusiasts, you might just want safe conditions, adequate pay, and reasonable hours. Those two things come into conflict with each other when, the standard rehearsal time is about 4 weeks for a play. As a sort of theatre enthusiast, you might be like, oh, well, 4 weeks isn't really enough, so I need to do loads and loads of prep in order to make sure that it's actually any good, or that my performance is good, or whatever, or work outside of hours. But as a worker, if you're doing all of this unpaid work for free, that's not only negatively impacting the amount of your time in your life that you are focusing on your work, but also it kind of sets a new milestone for how theatre has to be made. So I remember us in Equity, the performers and creative workers union, includes directors and stage managers and all the gang. We were having a chat about how we can make sure that if you're being told to be off book for day one, so that means knowing all your lines before the first day of rehearsals, that there should be a fee attached to do that learning. Otherwise, that's usually a thing that you would do in rehearsals. And obviously you're paid for that time. You go through and you sort of repeat the process again and again. You repeat the scenes again and again. And that way you end up learning the lines, or you go off and you do a sort of like line running drill with your fellow actors. But if you're being told you need to be off book for day one, I mean, that then saves loads and loads of time. So that might be very good for the theatre, because it means, they instantly get a better standard of show potentially. But it's not good for us as a workforce, who are then expected to do all of this extra work completely for free. And that's where you get this kind of tension between the worker and the enthusiast, because the enthusiast or potentially even the artist might be like, I want to make the work that is of the greatest quality. And for the worker, it's like, oh, that is bringing down my rate of pay because of all the extra hours that I've done for free. Anyway, we'll carry on.
Most of the time, we don't consciously acknowledge this distinction, but it is significant. In a professionalised industry, a person who makes theatre is usually both a theatre enthusiast and a theatre worker, and these two identities make distinct, sometimes contradictory, demands on us. Furthermore, the former tends to win out over the latter. It is often more appealing to think of oneself as an artist or a constituent of a community than as a worker, especially a worker who is being ripped off. Losing sight of this distinction creates a situation where we think of ourselves not as workers, but as the providers of a public good. From here, the creation of the show comes to be more important than the well-being of the workers. Our desire for theatre to be better has pushed us further into a kind of voluntary exploitation.
So I'll just give a bit more of an example for this as well. This even seeps into equity, our unions conference. I remember a couple of years ago, someone got up on the podium and was speaking in favor of this motion that was to make sure that there were paper cast lists for various shows. This person who's a member and, like a great person, she had served the union for like many years and was really, really great. But she was saying, she went to see a show and there were no paper cast lists. And so how would these members be seen by the industry and make sure that they could work again and all that sort of stuff? She wanted them to make sure that they had adequate exposure. The retort back was, this was not a perspective that was coming from a theatre worker. The workers in that very show had not requested paper cast lists. The cast lists were up online. And so any casting directors or other directors or whatever could already see who was in the play. So this demand of hers, which she literally said in her speech, was coming from the perspective of a theatre goer, not a worker in it. So this was a thing, she was kind of harking back to a time where, this is the way that these things were done and this is how people maintained their careers. But things have changed now and workers are not demanding cast lists that are kind of printed out. Like, yeah, definitely people need to be credited online, but this is not an issue for most workers. Most workers are not worried about this. What they might be worried about is their digs. So we've had a big campaign for the dignity in digs, which, we require a massive overhaul of the dig system. Digs, if you don't know, are like your accommodation. In all other industries, they call it accommodation, but in the theatre, darling, we talk about it as digs, which is kind of, like romantic old idea of staying in a nice elderly lady's kind of spare room. She's helping the theatre out by providing cheap accommodation. That exists a little bit still, but mostly it's, Airbnb landlords and, the conditions are pretty terrible and really, really expensive. So we don't want to be worrying about paper cast lists. We want to be worrying about what are our like working and living conditions like. We want to be improving pay massively. We don't want to be worrying about those kinds of things. And that kind of distinction is really, really important for us in the union, because our primary concern is not whether the audiences think that things are going nicely or not. Our primary concern is, what are the workers thinking? What are the workers feeling? And what are their concerns in their industry? And so, yeah, like I say, paper cast lists were not one, but accommodation and pay and conditions definitely were and continue to be issues. So we want to focus on those rather on a perception of an audience member who thinks like, oh, there should be some cast lists or whatever. Anyway, I banged on about that too long. Let's carry on.
This is good news for our employers and potentially for
It's your boy.
audiences too. But the only benefit to us as theatre workers is that we get to be involved in something that we think is good. And that doesn't pay the rent. The theatre industry thrives on a sense of community and on the personal satisfaction that people take from being involved in the creation of art. It thrives on the fact that we interpret the commercial and critical success of a show or a venue with which we are associated as a success of our own, even as a viable substitute for monetary remuneration.
Now, that's a really tricky point to navigate, as voiced by your boy. So navigating that point, which is that people find adequate remuneration. I always want to say remuneration, but it's remuneration, in being in something that is good, that is well received, that is critically acclaimed. And so, you know, if you've only been paid £450 a week, something like that, but you know the show is really good, that can feel like, wow, I was really part of something. But you keep doing that year after year and your pay doesn't seem to be going up. That then becomes a real problem, especially as people get older and they get dependents or mortgage, or to be honest, you get that with rent, of course, particularly in London. It's just insane right now, and has been forever. You know, you can end up feeling way too grateful and way too satisfied with being involved in something that has a bit of a buzz around it. However, the tricky thing to navigate there is people want to maintain careers over years and years and years. And it can be really worth it to be in something that's really good, that looks good on your CV and, you know, can then potentially get you further work, particularly for actors. It means, you know, you might get a TV job out of something, or off the back of something that's done really well. For directors, it means they might make a bit of a name for themselves and eventually start earning a kind of decent amount of money from it. Probably not though, because I mean, directing's a whole other thing that is paid so horrifically in the theatre. It's insane. But this is why it's really tricky for us as theatre workers, people who want to unionize the workforce as much as possible and kind of build the political consciousness and consciousness about our working conditions and our pay and everything. It's really tricky because people are like, yeah, no, I totally get that pay's really bad, but I want to be in that show. I want to be in that show with that person because it might get me more work. And there's always a horizon in the distance where you can see yourself working regularly and being very comfortable and doing a TV show here or there and being able to pay the bills and live comfortably, live a comfortable life. And that dream then feels like it's worth putting in the months and years of not being paid very well, but being in something that's really good, which is why you end up getting people feeling really grumpy when a show is not well received, because they know they're being exploited, or they're, at least in those conditions, they are heightened aware of being really exploited while being in this thing that's making them miserable, which is maybe an interesting point to try to, you know, start organizing around. Because if you've got a really dissatisfied cast and stage management and everyone, then potentially they might be more interested in some kind of industrial action if they're like, not only are we not being paid very well, but also this show is a pile of trash. So I'm not interested in just doing it in order to make the theatre money or to just make the theatre break even or whatever. But yeah, I think for our kind of, you know, political education, it's really good for us to have a real clear distinction between these two perspectives that we all have as theatre workers, to help us make better decisions and to think clearly about all of this. Anyway, let's carry on.
Improving our working conditions requires us to think as workers. If we're going to address urgent sector-wide issues like pay, safety, stress, workload, long hours, bullying and harassment, or work-life balance, we must strategically set aside our enthusiasm or our hopes for the progressive potential for our creative output and prioritize instead our identity as workers, people who undertake tasks for money and who naturally want to do a little less of the former for a little more of the latter.
A little less of the former for a little more of the latter. A little less working for a little more money, baby. Okay, good.
What does this change in perspective lead to?
People grumble about their work a lot, but in the theatre, as in many workplaces, we often shy away from the conversations that could bring us together and lead to improvements. We habitually end a long list of complaints by trying to be upbeat, reaffirming that we wouldn't do it if we didn't love it, or that this is just the way things have to be.
Or also, the show must go on, darling. Of course, the show must go on. So it doesn't matter what happens, the show has to happen. Which is a really kind of mad, toxic thing, really, because it just means it doesn't matter what is happening. The show must continue. The cogs must turn. And actually, we do have the power to stop the cogs turning if we are not happy. So yeah, as opposed to ending those conversations upbeat is what we do quite a lot in the theatre in particular. But I think in probably quite a lot of workplaces, particularly workplaces in the arts and culture sector, we end up being like, oh well, this is how it should be, or not even should be, but this is the way things are, so what are you going to do? Instead, we could have a kind of different kind of productive moaning that means that we're moaning in order to solidify a demand and then work out how we're going to win that demand, whether that's better pay or to stop doing so much unpaid time out of hours, whatever it is. If we did a load of that moaning together, but didn't end it with a, oh, well, we might win some stuff, or at least some better stuff anyway. Winning better stuff. Let's carry on.
When we hear our colleagues complain about their workload, pay, or treatment, the kind of support we habitually offer is to reassure them that things aren't so bad, or simply to let them vent until it's all out of their system and they're ready to get back to work. This way, nothing changes.
We can learn new ways to support each other and ourselves. The seed of transformative collective action lie in how we interact with each other on a simple interpersonal level. This can start with some very basic strategies. Ask your stage manager what time they expect to start and end their working day during rehearsals and during the run. Learn the names of the technicians, crew and front of house staff you're working with. Find out who does all the jobs that enable you to do your job. Get the people you work closely with used to discussing the fact that you all have needs as people doing a job, which might be separate from your needs as people creating a work of art. Think about how you volunteering to go the extra mile creates the expectation that other people will too, and that makes them look uncommitted when they don't, or can't, or won't. Let people know that you've noticed when you see that they're overworked. Talk to them about it. We're used to putting up with dodgy situations at work. Individually, we often don't have a choice. Collectively, we do.
Collectively, we do, comrades. Yeah. That thing of going the extra mile is really hard because we are in such a competitive industry where you kind of have to relentlessly go the extra mile in order to get a job. You know, I've said in a previous video about feeling such gratitude when you get a job. You can sort of feel a bit like the claw from Toy Story, where it's like the claw is our master, the claw chooses who will go and who will stay, and if the claw picks you, you just feel so grateful, so much gratitude, that you kind of forget to ask how much we actually been paid for this job and what are the conditions behind it. So, you know, generally that means that particularly in the subsidized sector of theatre, where you're doing relatively kind of short jobs, you don't end up knowing your terms and conditions that well. It is kind of different on the West End, because on the West End, people have jobs for like a year. And so it means they do really get to know what their conditions are like. and how much they're changing from year to year. If people do a kind of get an extension on their contract, or they do another year, they can notice like, oh, hold on, we don't get push and pull anymore, or we aren't given this thing or that thing. Those things are all negotiated by the union equity, those kind of collective agreements with various different producers or groups of producers. Actually, speaking of which, the union recently won a 16.7% pay rise for people on the West End, which was really, really great. And the members seemed absolutely delighted with it. That was good. We did a campaign for 17% and we ended up getting 16.7, which is pretty good. You know, pretty much there. And members fought hard for it and were part of the negotiating team. So that was really great. But anyway, talking about going the extra mile, that's a real problem, because constantly when everyone is going the extra mile, these set new minimum standards where it's like you haven't done loads and loads of work outside of rehearsals, or even when you're trying to get a job, like, oh, you haven't learnt the sides for the audition, or whatever it is. We can end up doing so much more work in order to just get a job, let alone then when you're in a job and you want to make sure that you impress and you give a really good performance, or you do a really good job as a stage manager or as a director or as a designer. All of that can be so hard to navigate, because like I said before, on the horizon is always like, oh, well, if I do really well in this job, maybe if that does well, and then I can do well off the back of it and I can get another job. But if we keep on thinking in this kind of rat race, hamster wheel sort of way, then probably nothing ever improves. So we have to think collectively, which is why you should get involved with your union. Please.
We work in an industry that often pretends to be anything but that. Our work is presented to us as a hobby, a passion, a route to personal fulfillment, a social duty, a form of activism, or as participation in a big fun community. When we recognise our activity is work, and ourselves and each other as workers, it will allow us to relate in transformative ways.
Wow. We can relate in transformative ways.
Written by Mediocre Dave, voiced by Chloe Massey,
Legend.
Sam Swan,
Legend.
and Enya Koronkwo.
Legend.
Illustrated by Siddhi Gupta.
Legend.
Edited by Sam Swan.
Legend. Yeah, Mediocre Dave. He's so good. He's so good. What I love
Imagine demand and build a world transformed.
So that's because this is a video on the World Transformed YouTube channel. So go and check it out if you want it without my ramblings over the top of it. But yeah, I think Dave is so brilliant. Such a great teacher, because he ends up getting quite complicated ideas, but he sort of explores one at a time, one complicated idea at a time, and explores it in as simple language as is humanly possible. He describes a thing that I think people can really relate to. Anyone I've shown that to from the industry absolutely recognizes this problem, this kind of strange phenomenon of having these dueling and kind of contradictory perspectives. And I think from that point, once you realize that you've got these two perspectives, that then informs what you need to do next. So you can then go, my concerns as a worker are this and this and this, and that is the same as this person and this person and this person. Because otherwise, as an artist or as an enthusiast, your taste might diverge quite a bit. So one person might think, oh, well, actually, I prefer to make work this way, or I prefer to make work this way. Or when I go to theatre, I like seeing this, or I don't really like Shakespeare. I think Shakespeare is a genius. So like, you can end up having such different opinions as a sort of artist or enthusiast that are, very interesting to discuss and great and whatever. Whereas as workers, your concerns are probably going to be way more consistent with other workers. And once you can then organize around those, pinpoint which concerns are widely and deeply felt, and can you start organizing around those in order to win, then we can start getting somewhere as an industry or as workers within this industry. Thanks very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and please like and subscribe and all that sort of stuff. I'm going to try and do more videos like this sometime. I don't know. Cheers.